In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the 4th century, and in particular looking at a series of wars that Rome waged that resulted in Rome taking control of the Italian peninsula. We'll start by looking at their military conflicts, in particular with the Samnites, and then look at the sack of Rome by Gaul, and the results of this century of warfare. Actually, can we start over?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I just screwed up the beginning.
Okay. And if you want to just reset for 10, 15 seconds, we'll take it from there.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
Actually, let me change something on my slide. Okay.
Okay. Whenever you're ready.
I'm ready. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the 4th century in Rome, and in particular looking at a series of wars. We'll begin by looking at these military conflicts with a range of other cities in which, for the most part, Rome emerges victorious, and in particular with the Samnites and the consequences of these conflicts with the Samnites. The end result being that Rome ends up controlling the entire Italian peninsula. So starting with the beginning of the 4th century BC, in 396, Rome undertakes an attack on the Etruscan city of Veii. And Veii is marked on the map on the left-hand part of your slide with the arrow. And so this is a part of Etruria. It's in southern Etruria. It's not too far from Rome. It's near Latium. This had long been a powerful Etruscan city and a long-term rival of Rome. And so when Rome attacks Veii and successfully conquers it, integrates the people of Veii into Rome, gives them citizenship, some of them actually come live in Rome, and sets up the city of Veii as a kind of suburb of Rome. This is a really significant move, and it's Rome's first attempt to expand in a permanent way outside of Latium. It's also in the beginning of the 4th century that Rome suffers what is, in historical terms, one of its most memorable setbacks. The actual events were probably not so memorable, not so significant, but it's an event that historians remember, repeat over and over and over again, all the way to the 4th century AD and the beginnings of the 5th century AD, when Rome is once again sacked by Alaric and the Goths. But in 387 BC, Rome is actually sacked by Gauls. So there had been a series of tribes that had crossed over the Alps into northern Italy and set up settlements both in northern Italy and along the east coast of Italy, so on the other side, on the eastern side of the Apennine Mountains. And these Gauls were essentially raiding tribes. They weren't interested in setting up permanent settlements. They were just raiding, trying to get wealth. And so this group of Gauls makes its way into Rome, successfully defeats the Roman defenses, and takes over the city for a short amount of time. Now, they're not really interested in settling in Rome, in conquering Rome, in inhabiting Rome, and setting it up as a Gallic capital. And that's an important thing for the Romans, because had they been, Rome would have been in some significant trouble. But in fact, they're just basically interested in sacking the city, raiding the citizens, getting whatever money they can, and then leaving. But one of the famous stories that comes out of the Gallic sack of Rome in 387 is the bravery of the consul-made dictator Camillus. And Camillus is given credit for actually coming in, waging a war with the Gauls in Rome, and kicking them out. Now, in reality, the Gauls had no interest in staying, so it's unclear exactly what Camillus actually did. But certainly in the mythology of Roman history, Camillus is remembered as the great defender of the city who saved Rome from the Gauls. And this will be the only time that Rome is sacked, apart from then Alaric about 700, 800 years later. So it's a significant event in that sense. But the reality of what actually happened is that some families lost some wealth. The city, the statues were probably destroyed. Public buildings were massacred. But in terms of sort of permanent effects, probably not very significant. Much more significant in the 4th century is a series of wars starting in the middle of the 4th century that Rome waged with the Samnites. The Samnites were a loose confederacy of tribes, but a very strong power and a significant rival for power in Italy. The Samnites, again, they didn't live with a sort of coherent government structure the way that the Romans did in the Republic. But when it came time to war, the Samnite tribes were very good at uniting and fighting for a common cause, and controlled a significant amount of territory down in the region of Italy that was southeast of Rome and east of Campania. And you can find this on the map on the previous slide, or in your textbook. But the Samnites were really a significant power in southeast Italy in the middle of the 4th century. This first conflict, the details are really sketchy. It seems that the Samnites had some kind of military conflict with another group, another city, that Rome got in the middle of, and eventually Rome sort of comes out of this conflict claiming victory over the Samnites. Exactly how much the Romans actually fought is not entirely clear, but they seem to have done something, but certainly they were getting involved in a conflict between the Samnites and another city, and preventing the Samnites from expanding their power base further, particularly in Campania. The result of this engagement with the Samnites in the middle of the 4th century is that Rome seems to have gained significant power and influence in Campania. So on the one hand, at the very beginning of the 4th century, we have them gradually expanding northward into Etruria, and not very far, just over the border into southern Etruria. But now with the Samnite wars, we see them extending their power south into Campania and into areas where they're going to come into contact with Greek colonists in particular. Probably the most important thing that comes out of the First Samnite War is something that results in Rome asserting its dominance over its other Latin allies, so these other cities in Latium. The allies weren't too happy with Rome's intervention in this conflict between the Samnites and another city, and they revolt. Partly they feel a lot of pressure to provide soldiers for Roman conflicts that they don't always buy into. But yet, because they are allies, they're required to provide soldiers for these battles. They resented Rome for forcing them into military conflicts that they didn't really believe in, and felt like this was a good time to try to resist Rome. The end result of this is that Rome, in fact, manages to sort of reassert its dominance over these allies. It manages to force these allies into a stronger relationship of dependence and allows it to extend its rule down into Campania. So in some funny ways, even though Rome probably didn't play a significant role in actually fighting the Samnites, the result of the interaction with the Samnites is that it allows them to reassert dominance over its fellow cities in Latium, as well as extend rule into Campania. And many of the Campanian cities that it takes over, it sets up as what are called municipia. And these are interesting governmental structures or political structures. Basically, it's the equivalent of a suburb. So a municipia meant that the citizens had full citizenship and voting rights. Now, they had to come to Rome to actually exercise those voting rights, but it meant that it was, in essence, an outpost of Rome. And as we'll see over the course of the 4th century, Rome establishes a range of relationships with cities and peoples that it takes control of. Not all of them get full voting rights. But these initial cities in Campania are set up really as outposts in the same way that Veii was. So, what we see now is Rome creating these sort of satellite cities. It would maintain the local governmental structure would stay the same ruling families would be kept in place as long as they were loyal to Rome, and the citizens would have Roman citizenship. So not a lot would change for the people living there as long as they were willing to identify themselves with Rome. And many of them sort of would do that in a sort of general way, but retain their local ethnic identity, whatever that was. So they would sort of ostensibly declare themselves citizens of Rome, but for the most part, in these municipia, life would continue as always. But they would have the rights of citizenship. They also had the responsibilities of citizenship, in particular supplying military men to serve in the military. So the aftermath of the First Samnite War then is, for the most part, we have these cities set up as municipia. Some communities remained completely independent and just became allies of Rome. So they had a looser relationship to Rome. They were still required to supply soldiers, but they were not Roman citizens, they didn't have the rights of citizens, and they didn't have as many of the responsibilities. Incorporation was not always peaceful, as one can imagine. So some cities would just kind of go with the flow, but others would really resist Roman occupation. And when that happened, Rome had no problem exerting its dominance. Some of the tactics that Rome used to get these resistant citizens in line included land confiscations. So they would take away their land and give it either to other people, other citizens in that city, or sometimes to veterans who needed land, or to other citizens in Rome. These members of the conquered cities would be displaced. They would be taken away from their city and put somewhere else. Sometimes they would be thrown into slavery, and that was not unknown, and they would be sold. So money would come to Rome. And finally, the land could be taken and colonized. So Rome was also at this time establishing colonies. And we'll talk a little bit more about what a colony looked like and who these colonists were in a bit. But these were ways that Rome would retaliate against citizens or cities that resisted their incorporation. It's important to note that at this point in time, Rome did not impose taxes on its municipalities or its allies. Eventually it will, and this will become a significant issue in the Republic and into the Empire. But for now, it's really giving these cities certain rights, but apart from asking them to supply soldiers, it's and of course making them liable to the occasional requirement to pay a tribute when Rome was in a particular financial crisis, it wasn't imposing an annual tax. It wasn't forcing them to pay very high taxes to Rome as their subsidiaries. So here's some review questions. I'll let you press pause, go over these, and then pick up the lecture. So the First Samnite War wasn't particularly eventful in of itself. It was more important for what it led to, the consequences. The Second Samnite War was quite a bit different, and in this instance we have fairly clear evidence that Rome was indeed engaged with Samnite forces. Again, though, our historical sources are very, very sketchy, and they're biased, and so it's really difficult to reconstruct anything approaching an accurate account of the Second Samnite War, knowing who did what even, knowing what consul led what army. Even those kinds of details are contested. And so it's important to keep in mind that we can talk about the general events, we can talk about the clear consequences of the Second Samnite War, but in terms of reconstructing a narrative of the events of the war, we're basically out of luck. The war itself lasted over 20 years. It extended from 326 to 304, so up to the end of the 4th century, leading into the very beginnings of the 2nd century BC. The Romans were really back on their heels for the first decade of fighting. And again, remember that this fighting was not constant. It was seasonal. So these campaigns would happen in fits and starts. So when we're talking about a 20-year war, this wasn't the equivalent of, soldiers being out on campaign on a daily basis for 20 years. We're really talking about sort of a series of battles, a series of confrontations that extended over that period of time. But in the meantime, soldiers would return home, they would cultivate their crops, they would go on with life as usual. One of the more interesting or significant events of the Second Samnite War was a moment when the Samnites really had the Roman forces with their backs against the wall, quite literally. They had trapped the Roman army in a pass, so sort of an area where there was no escaping behind them, and big walls of mountains on the side, a narrow, what's called a defile. But essentially, the Roman army had gotten pressed back into this and couldn't retreat. There was nowhere to retreat. They couldn't go up. These were high cliff walls. The only way to go was forward, in where they would encounter the Samnite forces. And this forced this army to surrender to the Samnite forces. And the location where this happens is called the Caudine Forks. This is the geographical location. And the surrender at the Caudine Forks was incredibly memorable. Roman armies didn't often face this kind of humiliating defeat, but in this case they did. And one of the things that they had to do was actually pass under the yoke. And what this meant was actually sort of going under. The soldiers would hold their weapons up, and the Roman army had to go under that. And this was significant. It was symbolic of yoking an animal. So one of the sort of interesting things, if you go to a military wedding, you see when the bride and groom come out, they hold their swords up. Well, that's actually what the bride and groom are doing, is passing under the yoke. And it's symbolic of enslavement. So, the old ball and chain jokes about getting married, well, that's what that means, essentially. But it's the idea that, now these two people are yoked together in some kind of mutual enslavement. But when an army did this, it wasn't such a happy occasion. And it was incredibly humiliating. I mean, it was treating the soldiers like animals. I should also note that this is the yoke, as in the yoke that animals wore. not the yolk from an egg with an L. So previous semesters I've had students get a little bit confused about this. But no, we are not passing under any egg yolks. We're going under the yolk of the animal. It was the thing that sort of kept the plow animals yoked together and working in basically a form of enslavement to their master. And so the Roman army enters under the yoke, this humiliating defeat to the Samnites. Things are not looking good for them. But the Samnites are not really a particularly unified force. They don't have a unified government back home, so they're not in a great position to actually challenge Rome's dominance in Latium and even in Campania. But it's still the case that up until about 314, the Samnites are clearly have the upper hand, and the Campanian municipalities and allies are recognizing that, hey, this may be a good chance for us to abandon Rome and go either declare our independence or ally ourselves with the Samnites. And so there's a real threat here that Rome is going to lose the gains that it had made, particularly in the southern part of Italy. And then in 311, things get even worse when the Etruscan cities ally with the Samnites. So these cities to the north of Latium. So now you basically have a big war for the control of Italy. And of course the Etruscans are thinking that not that they're going to enter into a relationship of submission to the Samnites, but rather that this is a temporary mutually beneficial relationship that is going to allow the Etruscans eventually to gain control of Rome and perhaps the rest of Latium. As it happens, Rome comes back. This is a hugely important comeback for them, and they win a series of battles. The events of these battles are sketchy, but the end result is that they win, they emerge victorious, they repress not just the Samnites, but these Campanian cities that are threatening to revolt. They get them back in line, and they fend off the Etruscans from the north. So this then leads pretty quickly to the Third Samnite War, and I promise this is the last one. And this war extends from 298 to 290, so here in the very beginnings of the 3rd century BC. And we continue here with the Samnites essentially allying with a number of other forces in Italy. They join forces once again with the Etruscans, the Umbrians, and the Gauls to the north. And this is really the first attempt of these Italian cities to the north, the Umbrians and Gauls. So the Gauls are not Italians, but the Umbrians, but also the Gallic forces. This is really the first attempt for them to, in a serious way, ally themselves against Rome and try to, in a united way, take down Rome. And it's clear that that's what this is about. That Rome is becoming a powerful force. It's seen as very threatening to the security of cities in the north. And so these Samnite wars provide an opportunity for the Etruscans and other cities in the north to try to secure their position by allying with the Samnites against the Romans. As it happens, Rome has learned a lot from its 20-plus year engagement with the Samnites, and this time it defeats these allied forces pretty easily. And one of the constants through Roman military engagement that we see is that they always learn from their mistakes. They very rarely make the same mistake twice. And when they're engaged in long military conflicts, Rome is very good at innovating, at figuring out how to move forward, how to defeat an enemy. So they don't just keep trying the same strategy over and over again. They're constantly innovating. And we'll see this really in full force when Rome engages in a series of military conflicts with Carthage. So they defeat these allied Samnite forces and make peace treaties that are favorable, obviously, to Rome. The end result of this, again, very importantly, is that they now control all of Italy. except a very few regions of the valley south of the Alps, which is still inhabited by the Gauls, and the very far south, which is still settled by Greek colonists. So the area around the Bay of Naples, and farther down, Sicily, Sardinia, and so forth. But they control an enormous expanse in Italy. So essentially, what happens from the middle of the 4th century into the beginning of the 3rd century in a very quick period of time through these engagements with the Samnites and then the allied forces of the Samnites is that Rome emerges as the dominant force in Italy by the beginning of the 3rd century, around 290. It needs to figure out how to deal with these conquered cities, and it establishes a variety of relationships with them. They range from Municipia, where they grant full rights of citizenship to the inhabitants, to cities without the right to vote. So there are also what are called Municipia sine suffragio. So it just means you don't have the right to vote. And they basically negotiate with individual cities a variety of agreements. But the common feature of these agreements is that these cities are essentially now Roman, governed by Rome or by Rome people that are favorable to Rome. So when they can, they keep local families in charge of the cities, and they try to actually not change too much. But they make sure that those local families are loyal to Rome and are not going to revolt when they have an opportunity. They also establish colonies in a number of places where they feel like they need to have a secure military presence. And these colonies are quite interesting. They're settled by Roman citizens who actually give up their rights of citizenship and take on whatever rights that area had. And so one of the sort of interesting questions is, why would somebody give up the rights of citizenship to go be a colonist? Well, to some extent, it seems like sort of like people who participated in the gold rush, or who were pioneers coming from the East Coast and settling the Midwest and the West in the 19th century, that what we have here are people sort of looking for an opportunity, that they maybe don't have land at home in Rome, that they're indebted. It's unclear exactly what their situation is, but that somehow they see this as an opportunity, and that it's worth giving up their rights of citizenship for this opportunity. For Rome's sake, these colonies are established in places where they need to have a strong presence, and often a military presence. So they're strategically placed where Rome feels like its territory is vulnerable to attack. And so they want citizens that are loyal to Rome living there, even if they're not Roman citizens themselves. And so what we have, by the beginning of the 3rd century then, is Rome being the dominant city in Italy, and having negotiated a range of relationships with these conquered cities, that in some cases make them essentially suburbs, with very little, if any, distinction from Rome itself, and in other cases very loosely connected to Rome, that they're simply just allies. And the particularities would vary from city to city. And it's at this time that Rome starts to look west. So it's in an expansionist mood. It's taken over Italy, but it's not happy. It's thinking maybe we can expand westward. And in particular, what it's interested in is Carthage. And so the big red arrow here is pointing to Carthage on the tip of what is modern Tunisia. So this area in North Africa. You can see just geographically why it would be a city that Rome was particularly interested in. As we'll talk about in the next lecture, was settled by Phoenicians originally and has evolved into an extraordinarily powerful city in the Western Mediterranean, and controls a number of strategically important areas notably Sardinia and Sicily. So as I said, Carthage is originally a Phoenician colony. We'll talk more about that in some subsequent lectures. Reputedly founded by Dido. We'll talk more about who Dido is. We're going to talk about Dido and Aeneas in class. The important thing for Rome is that Carthage controlled really significant territory, both in Africa, but especially in Sicily and Sardinia. So Carthage controlled a huge amount of coastal territory that made it a very rich trading nation. It had a strong sea presence and was really an important power in the Western Mediterranean. And if Rome hoped to itself be an important power beyond Italy, it was going to have to come into contact with Carthage. It does seem like sort of as early possibly as 500 BC, Rome had created peace treaties between Carthage and itself, and that Carthage had also had peace treaties in place with other Italian cities. We have fairly good archaeological evidence that Carthage was engaged in some significant trade of both goods and even migration of peoples with Etruria. And so it seems we don't really see the same thing in Latium, but clearly there has been some kind of contact prior to the 3rd century with Carthage and Italy. Rome first comes into contact with Carthage, or into conversation with Carthage in a serious way when a dispute arises between Carthage, Rome, and Syracuse is a city on Sicily, over this very important geographical feature, the Straits of Messina. And as we talked about in a very early lecture, when we were talking about the geography of Rome, the Straits of Messina it's really the passageway between the Western Mediterranean and the Eastern Mediterranean. And so whoever controls these controls a lot of the trade back and forth. So for obvious reasons, then, it becomes a point of dispute between these powers in the Mediterranean. So here are some review questions. I'll let you go over these, and when you're done doing that, you're done with today's lecture.